$3 for the pine box, the auctioneer said, slapping the lid with his cane. Nailed shut. Sold as is. No opening, no asking, no hefoods. Eliza Holloway raised her hand before she knew her arm had moved. The crowd turned. 40 pairs of eyes in the dust-choked square of Bitter Hollow, Wyoming, swung toward the widow in the gray wool dress, and not one of them looked kind. A man behind her spat tobacco juice near her boot. A woman in a calico bonnet crossed herself twice and stepped back like Eliza had caught fire. $3, ma'am? The auctioneer squinted. You sure? Ain't no horse in there. Ain't no flour. Ain't no plow. Just a box. $3, Eliza said again. Her voice came out flatter than she felt. Her heart was hammering against the locket at her throat, the one with her dead husband's hair coiled inside it. And I want it loaded onto my wagon before sundown. 4, called a voice from the back. She turned. Sheriff Bram Caldwell stood with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, that smile of his cutting sideways across his beard. The smile that meant he wanted something. The smile that had meant trouble for her husband 6 months back, on the night Thomas rode out and never rode home. 5, Eliza said. 6, said Caldwell. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Whatever was in that pine box, the sheriff wanted it, and now everyone knew it. The auctioneer's eyes flicked between them, calculating. $7, Eliza said. It was nearly everything in her apron pocket. It was the money for next month's flour. Caldwell's smile faltered. He looked at her, really looked, and something colder passed behind his eyes. He saw a widow. He saw a woman who shouldn't have anything left to spend. He saw a problem. Let her have her coffin then, he said, raising both hands in mock surrender. Hope whatever's in there don't bite. The crowd laughed. Eliza didn't. The auctioneer brought down his cane. Sold to the widow Holloway for $7. It took 3 men to load the pine box on her wagon, and they did it grudging, eyes elsewhere, like the wood itself was diseased. The box was longer than a man and a hand wider, made of green pine, hastily planed, the nails driven crooked. No name burned into the lid. No cross. Whoever had built it fast. She climbed onto the buckboard and gathered the reins. The gray mare flicked her ears back, uneasy. Horses always know first. Mom. A boy of maybe 12 had come up beside the wagon, barefoot, freckled, breathing hard like he'd run. He shoved something in her hand, a folded scrap of paper, hot from his palm. Man told me to give you this. Said don't read it till you're out of town. What man? Didn't say his name. Tall fella. Had a scar like a fishhook on his jaw. The boy was already backing away. He said, thank you, ma'am. He said you don't know what you bought. Then he was gone, vanishing between 2 clapboard buildings. Eliza closed her fist on the paper. Down the street, Sheriff Caldwell was watching her. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. She flicked the reins, and the mare lunged forward like she'd been waiting all afternoon to leave. The road home wound 7 miles through sage and red rock, and the sun was already bleeding into the western ridges by the time the wagon cleared the last bend out of Bitter Hollow. Wind pushed dust devils across the trail. The pine box rattled with every rut. She told herself it was just the road making it sound that way. A mile out of town, she unfolded the paper. 6 words, in pencil, in a hand that had shaken. He's alive. Do not open yet. The reins went slack in her fingers. The mare slowed, confused. Eliza stared at the words until the letters stopped meaning anything. Then she stared past them at the green pine lid behind her, and she listened. For a long moment, there was only wind, only the creak of the harness, only her own blood drumming in her ears. Then, faint, muffled, 3 slow taps from inside the wood. Knuckles against pine. Top, top, top. A pause. Then again. Top, top, top. A man's rhythm. A man too weak to do more. Eliza pressed her hand flat against the locket at her throat. Her dead husband's locket. Her dead husband, who had ridden out one Tuesday morning to deliver a witness deposition against Sheriff Bram Caldwell, and who had been found 3 days later in a draw, face down, with his pockets emptied and the deposition gone. He's alive. The mare snorted. The shadows had grown longer. Bitter Hollow was a smudge of smoke behind her now, but the road behind the smoke was empty for the moment. Eliza did not open the box. She did not call out. She did the only thing a woman with $7 left, a dead husband, and a sheriff watching her wagon roll out of town could do. She slapped the reins hard and drove. The mare broke into a canter. The pine box thumped once hard against the boards. From inside, a voice, broken, dust-dry, barely a voice at all, rasped 2 words she would remember for the rest of her life. Please, hurry. Behind her, far down the dimming road, she heard what she had been dreading. The distant, deliberate beat of hoofbeats. More than one rider. Coming slow. Coming sure. Eliza's homestead crouched in a fold of the hills, a low cabin of squared logs with a sod roof, and a barn behind it leaning slightly westward like a tired man. She had built most of it with Thomas. She had finished the chicken coop alone after. She drove the wagon straight into the barn, pulled the great doors shut behind her with the mare still in harness, and dropped the crossbeam into its brackets. Only then did she breathe. The barn smelled of hay and horse, and the faint copper of old blood from last winter's slaughter. A single shaft of dying sun came through the gable window and lay across the pine box like a finger pointing. She got the crowbar from the tool wall. Her hands would not stop shaking. I'm going to open it now, she said, mostly to herself, partly to whoever was inside. If you mean me harm, mister, I have a Henry rifle 2 steps behind me, and I know how to use it. A soft sound from the box. Could have been a laugh. Could have been a sob. She set the crowbar's claw under the lid and pulled. The nails screamed coming out. 1, 2, 3, 4. The lid lifted, and the smell hit her first. Sweat, dried blood, old fear, the sour breath of a man who had not drunk water in too long. Then she saw him. He was folded into the box like a letter into an envelope. A young man, maybe 30, dark hair matted to his forehead, a fishhook scar curling along his right jaw. His wrists were bound with rawhide. His shirt was stiff with old blood across the ribs. His eyes, when they opened, with a startling pale gray of river ice. Ma'am, he whispered. His lips cracked when they moved. I owe you my life. Don't talk yet. She cut the rawhide. She lifted his head onto her folded shawl. She fetched the water pail from the corner and let him drink in slow, careful sips. 3 swallows, then pause. 3 swallows, then pause, the way Thomas had taught her to water a horse that had gone too long without. When his eyes cleared a little, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. What's your name? Caleb. Caleb Reyes. United States Marshal Service, Cheyenne office. She closed her eyes. Of course. Of course he was. Thomas's deposition had been meant for a federal marshal. Thomas had ridden out to meet one. You were supposed to meet my husband, she said. 6 months ago. Thomas Holloway. The marshal's gray eyes went still as a frozen pond. Holloway. He never came. We thought he'd lost his nerve. He didn't lose his nerve. He lost his life. She said it without crying. She had used up her crying. Caldwell killed him. Took the papers. Caleb Reyes closed his eyes for a long second. Then I'm too late twice over. You're not dead yet. She wrung out a rag in the water bucket and pressed it to the wound on his ribs. He hissed, but did not pull away. Tell me how you came to be in a coffin in the Bitter Hollow auction yard. He told her in pieces, between sips of water. He had ridden into Bitter Hollow 2 weeks ago, posing as a saddle drummer, asking quiet questions about a land grab Caldwell was running with the railroad surveyors. 3 nights ago, Caldwell's men had jumped him in the livery, broken 3 ribs, put a knife into his side. They'd meant to bury him alive. The undertaker, a black man named Solomon Pike, who had no love for the sheriff, had been paid to nail the lid. Instead, Solomon had drilled 4 small breathing holes near the head, slipped a flask of water inside, and listed the coffin in the auction as unclaimed pauper's box, contents nailed. He gambled, Caleb whispered, that someone honest would buy it, or someone who hated Caldwell enough. He gambled right, Eliza said. He gambled on a widow with $7 and a grudge. She did not say, and nothing left to lose. She did not need to. She heard them before she saw them. 6 riders. Maybe 7. Their hooves came down the wagon track in the loose, careless rhythm of men who believed they would not be opposed. Through the crack in the barn door, she watched the dust plume rise pink in the last of the sunset, and she counted the riders' shapes against the sky. Sheriff Caldwell rode at the front. The big roan, the white hat, the smile she could not see from here but could feel anyway. Caleb tried to sit up. Failed. Mom, Mrs. Holloway, you get out the back. Take a horse. Ride for Fort Laramie. Ask for Marshal Hennessy. Tell him Reyes is... Hush. She was already moving. She covered him with a tarp and 3 bales of hay. She kicked dust over the bloody splinters from the coffin lid. She broke the pine box apart with the crowbar in 4 hard strokes and threw the boards into the firewood stack against the wall. Just more kindling, nothing remarkable. She brushed her hair back with her sleeve, smudged dirt on her cheek, and stepped out of the barn, closing the doors behind her like a woman who had been milking the goat. The riders pulled up at her gate as the last light died. Caldwell tipped his hat. Evening, Mrs. Holloway. Funny thing, auctioneer's records seem to show you bought a pine box today. Folks in town worried it might contain something contagious. Smallpox, maybe. We come to burn it for you. Public safety. I already burned it, Eliza said, and she gestured to the smoke curling from her chimney, where 15 minutes earlier she had fed the kitchen stove with dry sage. Box was empty. Some prankster's idea of a joke, I reckon. Just rocks and rags inside. Caldwell's smile thinned. Mind if we look in the barn, ma'am? She looked him dead in the eye. She thought of Thomas, face down in a draw. She thought of the Marshal bleeding into her hay. She thought of $7 and a piece of paper that said he's alive. I mind very much, Sheriff, she said. Come back with a warrant. Or come back with my dead husband. Either way, you're not setting foot on this place tonight. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Caldwell laughed, low and ugly, and turned his roan. Tomorrow, then, he said, over his shoulder. Tomorrow we'll come back proper. Sleep well, widow. The riders melted into the dark. Eliza stood at the gate until she could no longer hear their hooves, and then she stood there a while longer because her legs would not obey her. She did not sleep. She moved the Marshal from the barn to the root cellar beneath the cabin, dragging him on a horse blanket inch by inch down the wooden steps while he bit down on a folded rag so he would not cry out. By lantern light, she boiled water, packed his rib wound with sphagnum moss and clean linen the way her grandmother had taught her, and stitched the gash in his side with a needle from her sewing kit and silk thread from the hem of her wedding dress. You sew like a surgeon, Caleb whispered, sweat sliding down his temple. I sew like a woman who has buried 2 children and 1 husband and learned what skin holds and what skin lets go. She tied the last knot. Don't make me sew you again, Marshal. By the time the moon was high, he was asleep, breathing shallow but even. She climbed the cellar stairs and barred the trapdoor from above, then dragged the kitchen table over it. She loaded the Henry rifle. She loaded Thomas's old Colt. She loaded the double-barrel coach gun her father had given her on her wedding day. She set them at 3 different windows, with cartridges in tin cups beside each. She filled the wash boiler with water in case of fire. She let the goat and the chickens out of their pens. Better they scatter than burn. Then she sat in Thomas's chair by the cold hearth, with the Henry across her knees, and waited. Dawn came pale and yellow as old paper. With it came the riders. She heard the hooves first, then the wagon. They were not even pretending now. Caldwell had brought 8 men, 2 of them with badges he had no right to deputize, and a buckboard with a barrel of coal oil lashed to its bed. They meant to burn her out. Caldwell stopped at the gate and cupped his hands. Mrs. Holloway, we have a warrant. Step out onto the porch with your hands empty. She did not step out. She slid the barrel of the Henry through the gun slit she and Thomas had cut in the shutter the first winter, when the Sioux had been restless. She sighted on the coal oil barrel. She squeezed the trigger. The barrel exploded in a soft, ugly whump of orange flame. The buckboard horse reared, screamed, tore free of its traces and bolted. 2 of Caldwell's men were on fire from the splash. They rolled in the dirt, beating at themselves, shrieking. The other riders' horses scattered every direction at once. Caldwell's roan held. Caldwell held. You stupid widow, he roared. You just bought yourself a hanging. He drew his pistol and emptied it at the cabin. Lead chewed splinters from the doorframe. Eliza had already moved to the second window. She levered another round into the Henry, breathed out, and fired at his hat. The hat jumped off his head and tumbled in the dust. Caldwell flinched so hard he nearly fell from the saddle. "The next one's lower, Sheriff," she called through the slit. "Right out. Burn it." Caldwell screamed at his men. "Burn the whole damn place." 2 of them obeyed. They galloped past the cabin, tossing torches onto the sod roof and the barn shingles. The barn caught. The chicken coop caught. The sod roof of the cabin steamed, but did not yet burn. Eliza moved. She moved like she had practiced this in dreams. Out the back window with the coach gun. Around the kitchen wall. Through the smokehouse. She came up behind the man, torching her barn just as he turned, and she fired one barrel into the dirt at his horse's feet. The horse went mad. The man went off the back of it and landed wrong on his shoulder. She kicked his pistol away and put the coach gun's second barrel under his chin. "Down," she said. "Belly down. Hands behind your head." He went down. From the front of the cabin, she heard Caldwell shouting orders, heard a body fall, heard another shot. She had to get back. She tied the man's hands with baling wire and ran. When she came around the corner of the cabin, she stopped. Caleb Reyes was standing on the porch. He should not have been. He could barely walk. But he was upright against the doorframe, the Colt in his shaking left hand, his right pressed against his ribs, and he was looking down the sights at Sheriff Caldwell with the calm of a man who had decided which side of the dirt he meant to end the day on. "Marshal Caleb Reyes," he said, loud enough that the remaining riders heard. "United States Marshal Service. Sheriff Bram Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Holloway, the attempted murder of a federal officer, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. Drop the weapon." Caldwell stared at him like he was looking at a ghost. In a way, he was. For one frozen second, nothing happened. The barn roared behind them. The chicken screamed. The wind shifted and pushed smoke between the men like a curtain. Then Caldwell did the stupid thing. He raised his pistol. 2 shots cracked at once. Caleb's from the porch. Eliza's from the corner of the cabin where she had brought the coach gun up to her shoulder without remembering deciding to. Caldwell's roan bolted riderless across the yard. The sheriff lay on his back in the dust, both hands open at his sides, staring up at a sky he could no longer see. 3 of his remaining men dropped their weapons. The other 2 were already riding away as hard as their horses would carry them. Caleb's legs went out from under him. He slid down the doorframe onto the porch boards, the Colt clattering beside him. "Mrs. Holloway," he said faintly, "your barn's on fire. I noticed Marshal." She walked to him through smoke and dust and the bodies of bad men, and she knelt down, and she pressed her hand against the fresh red blooming through the linen on his ribs. "Stay with me, Caleb Reyes," she said. "You stay with me. You hear?" His pale gray eyes found hers. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, and then his head fell sideways against her shoulder, and he did not answer her again. She did not let him die. She dragged him into the cabin while the barn collapsed behind her in a roar of sparks. She put out the sod roof with the wash boiler water and a horse blanket in her bare hands until her palms were blistered raw. She tied the 3 surrendered men to the corral posts with their own belts and left them there for the federal marshals she would send for at first light. Then she went back to Caleb Reyes. His stitches had torn. He had lost more blood than a man his size could afford. She opened him again, cleaned him again, sewed him again, and this time when she tied the knot her hands were steady because she was no longer afraid. She had passed through fear the way a person passes through a doorway, and on the other side there was only the work. He woke at noon. He woke at dusk. He woke at midnight, and each time she was there with broth or water or a cool cloth or just her hand on his forehead so he would know he was not alone. On the 3rd day, he was strong enough to sit up. She brought him beef tea in a tin cup and sat on the stool beside the bed. Thomas's bed. She had not been able to sleep in it since the funeral, but she had given it to Caleb without thinking, and seeing him in it had not hurt the way she had feared. It had felt, strangely, like the bed was being used again for its right purpose. To hold a wounded man who would heal. "How long?" he asked. 3 days since the fire. 6 days since the auction. He looked at his hands, which were thinner than they had been. I never thanked you properly. You said it from the box. That was a dying man's thanks. I want to give you a living man's. He met her eyes. Mrs. Holloway. Eliza. Eliza then. He swallowed. I read your husband's name in the Cheyenne office 3 months ago. He had written us a letter. Did you know that? Before the deposition. He said if anything happened to him, we were to look after his wife. He said you were braver than any man he'd ridden with, and he wanted us to know it, in case he didn't get the chance to tell us himself. She had to look away, out the window, at the blackened skeleton of the barn, at the chickens already pecking among the ashes, at the long, pale Wyoming light. He never told me, she said quietly. He didn't have to. He wrote it where it mattered. To the men who'd come looking if he didn't come home. Caleb paused. I'm sorry I came too late for him. I'm sorry I came at all in a coffin instead of saddle. But I came, Eliza. The Marshals came. She turned back. He reached, slowly, painfully, into the pocket of the shirt she had washed and laid out for him. He took out something small and dark and held it in his palm. It was a brass badge, dented, scored along one edge where a knife had skipped off it. That, she realized, was probably what had saved his life when they had stabbed him. The badge had turned the blade just enough. This is yours now, he said. I'm not a marshal. No, but this badge stopped a knife once, and it'll do it again. And I want it to be where Thomas Holloway's widow can see it every day, so she knows the law remembers him. He pressed it into her hand and folded her fingers closed over it. Keep it, hang it on the wall, or put it in the locket with his hair. Whatever feels right. She could not speak for a moment. The brass was warm from his pocket. She could feel the dent under her thumb. Why a coffin? She asked finally. Why did Solomon Pike put you in the auction at all? Why not just hide you? Caleb almost smiled. Because Caldwell was searching every house in town. He'd have found me in a day. But a coffin in the auction yard, in plain sight, where any fool could bid on it. Caldwell never looked twice. He'd put it there himself. Far as he knew, I was already buried. He shook his head. Solomon's a smart man. He bet that the only person crazy enough to spend money on a sealed pine box in Bitter Hollow would be someone the sheriff had already wronged. He read the room right. He read me right. He read you right. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the burned timbers of the barn with a sound like soft whistling. A meadowlark sang somewhere down by the creek. The world, against all reason, was going on. Eliza, Caleb said, when I can ride, I have to go back to Cheyenne. There'll be a hearing. The charges against Caldwell surveyors, the land grab, the railroad men, it doesn't end with him dead. There's a network. I have to testify. I know. I want you to come. Not to testify, just to be there. The court will want to hear about Thomas. From someone who loved him. From someone who can say his name without it being a name in a file. He looked at her. Will you come? She thought about it. The badge in her hand. The locket at her throat. The $7 she had spent. The cost of mercy. The cost of refusing to look away. Yes, she said. I'll come. And then I'll come home. This is my place, Caleb Reyes. I built this with my hands. I'm not leaving it for any man, living or dead, good or bad. I wouldn't ask you to. She stood. She set the badge carefully on the mantel beside her wedding photograph, where the morning light would catch it. She went to the window and pushed it open. The smell of sage came in on the wind. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a hawk turned in a slow circle against the wide blue sky. Scars mean it lived, she said softly, mostly to herself. Mom. Something my grandmother used to say. About horses, mostly, but about people, too. She did not turn around. Thomas had a scar on his shoulder from a fall when he was 12. I used to trace it sometimes when he was sleeping. I thought it was ugly when I first saw it. She smiled, finally for the first time in 6 months. I learned different. Behind her, the Marshal in her dead husband's bed lay quiet, and somewhere down the road, she knew, dust was rising again. But this time it was federal riders, summoned by the rider she had sent at dawn, coming not to burn her down, but to take 3 tied men away and to bring the law back into Bitter Hollow at last. The hearing in Cheyenne lasted 4 days. Eliza wore her gray wool dress, the same one she had worn to the auction, mended at the hem and pressed with care, and she sat in the front row of the courtroom with a brass badge pinned beneath her collar where no one could see it, but she could feel it. Caleb Reyes testified for 2 hours on the first day, leaning on a cane, his ribs still wrapped beneath his shirt. Solomon Pike testified on the second day, dignified in a black suit, and when the prosecutor asked him why he had risked his life to save a stranger, he said only, "Because somebody had to, and the Lord put me close enough to do it." On the third day, they called Eliza. She walked to the witness chair the way she had walked across her yard with the coach gun, without hurry, without flinch. She put her hand on the Bible. She swore the oath. And when the prosecutor asked her to tell the court about her husband, she did not cry, and she did not falter. Thomas Holloway was a fence mender and a wheat farmer, she said. He did not own a fast horse or a fine rifle. He owned an honest name and a piece of paper that told the truth about Sheriff Bram Caldwell. He rode out to deliver that paper to a federal marshal, and he was killed for it. I've spent 6 months being told he was a fool for trying. I am here to say he was not a fool. He was a citizen, and a citizen who tells the truth in this country should be able to come home alive. The courtroom was so quiet she could hear the clerk's pen scratching. The jury returned a verdict in 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts against all 5 surviving conspirators. The railroad surveyors lost their charter. The land they had stolen was returned to the homesteaders they had stolen it from. A new sheriff was appointed to Bitter Hollow, a quiet young deputy out of Laramie who had served 2 years under the federal marshals and who would, in time, marry the schoolteacher and serve the town for 30 years. On the courthouse steps after, Caleb found her. He was leaning on his cane in the spring sunshine, and the pale gray of his eyes was not so much like ice anymore. More like river water in March, when the thaw is coming. "You're going home tomorrow," he said. "I am. I'd like to write to you, if that's allowed." She looked at him. She thought about it honestly. She thought about Thomas, who would not have begrudged her a letter from an honest man. She thought about her cabin, and her chickens, and her burn barn she would rebuild that summer with her own 2 hands, and the lumber the federal court had ordered Caldwell's estate to pay for. She thought about the long winters ahead, and how a letter every so often would not be a bad thing to find in the post. "Right," she said, "and when the snow melts next year, if you find yourself near Bitter Hollow, you can come and help me put up the new barn roof. I'll feed you. I won't promise more than that." "That's more than I dare ask, Eliza Holloway." "It's exactly what I mean to offer, Caleb Reyes." He took off his hat. He bowed, just slightly, the way a man bows when he is grateful and does not want to make a fuss about it. Then he walked away down the courthouse steps into the spring light, slow because of the cane, but upright. She watched him until he turned the corner. Then she went home. The new barn went up in June. Solomon Pike came out from Bitter Hollow for the raising, with 3 other men and his wife and a wagon full of fresh-cut planks. Caleb came up from Cheyenne for 2 weeks of his leave, and he climbed the roof beam himself, though his ribs still ached when he stretched, and he and Eliza nailed the ridge cap together at sundown on a Thursday, hammer strokes ringing out across the valley in counterpoint. When the last nail was driven, he straightened and looked at her across the peak of the roof. "What will you call it?" he asked. "The new barn." "It's just a barn, Caleb. Nothing built by your hands is just anything, Eliza." She thought about it. She looked down at the yard, at Solomon's wife setting out the supper table on sawhorses, at the chickens scratching among the new wood shavings, at her gray mare grazing peacefully in the corral the way she had not grazed peacefully in 6 long months. "I'll call it Thomas's barn," she said, "because he started it, and I finished it, and the marshal helped me nail the ridge." Caleb nodded. He did not speak. Some things did not need to be spoken. That night, after the others had gone, she sat on the porch alone in Thomas's chair with a cup of coffee in her hands. The brass badge was still on the mantel inside, beside the wedding photograph. The locket was still at her throat. The $7 were long spent. She thought about the coffin. She thought about the moment in the auction yard when her hand had gone up before her mind had caught up to it, and she understood now what she had not understood then, that some choices we make are not made by the part of us that thinks. They're made by the part of us that remembers who we are. Thomas had taught her who she was. The auction had only asked her to remember. A coyote called from the ridge. The mare answered with a soft snort. Somewhere on the eastern road, far off, a wagon was rolling slow under the stars. Not toward her, not tonight, but moving honestly along its way. She finished her coffee. She stood. She blew out the lamp. Years later, when the railroad finally came through Bitter Hollow and brought with it strangers who did not know the old stories, Eliza Holloway would sometimes be asked by curious children why her barn beam had two names carved into it, Thomas and Caleb, and a pair of dates 12 years apart. She would smile and say only this: "One name belongs to the man who taught me what was worth standing up for. The other belongs to the man I once bought for $7 at an auction in a pine box when I thought I was just bringing home wood for the fire." And then she would go back to her work, because there was always work, and the wide Wyoming sky above her cabin would turn its slow blue wheel, and far down the road the dust would rise gold in the late light. Not from riders coming, not anymore, but just from the wind moving freely across a country that at long last had learned how to let an honest woman live in peace.